nice presentations of 3 projects. First, we will have TEL, who will talk about the important concepts in the field of educational technology and draw the boundaries between them. Then we will have Paco and team, who will present their project on AI assistance. And then we have Rebecca and the team, who will talk about the universal design for learning. And just as a reminder, we have 15 minutes for presentations and then 5 minutes for questions. And I will keep an eye on the chat. Please type the questions that you have to present us as they go in the chat. And then you can also raise your hand at the end and ask your question in person. Without further ado, let me give the floor to Thea, who will start our session. Thea, we could not hear you.
Okay, let me start over then, Irene, I'm sorry for that. So, yeah, so today's presentation is about defining the boundaries between 4 fields that are all concerned about teaching and learning. It's a work we've done in collaboration with Smart Learning, an educational organization in Denmark. And a work that at the moment has been submitted to Frontiers for publication. So the 4 fields I'm going to talk about present a lot of similarities, but are also distinct in several aspects. These are artificial intelligence and education, computer-supported collaborative learning, educational data mining, and learning analytics. I put them on the slide in order of appearance. So in the early 80s, we saw AI in education. A decade later, early 90s, we saw computer-supported collaborative learning. Then mid-2000, we've seen educational data mining, and in 2011, the emergence of learning analytics. So just briefly what these are about. So AI in education is more about recognizing patterns, making predictions, and applying this knowledge to new scenarios. Computer-supported collaborative learning is all about social interactions and collaboration. Educational data mining is about extracting data from educational settings like VLEs or learning management systems. And learning analytics, as defined by the Journal of Learning Analytics, is about collecting, analyzing, and reporting data that can actually improve learning. So what do we know? A brief overview about each of these fields, and then I have a summary table that shows in a way how they relate and how they differ. So AI in education has several applications in education. For example, in how we assess students, how we provide feedback, how we profile and predict which students are going to drop out, and about producing student models in relation to academic achievement. So where we are up to now, so this is a review study published in 2019, which in a way says that most of the studies available today are quantitative in nature, and they lack a reflection on the risks, challenges, and ethical implications of those studies. And perhaps most importantly for us is that there is a weak connection of those studies to relevant educational theories that could improve our understanding of learning and teaching. So CSCL is all about collaboration, and we know that this is a very challenging thing to achieve both face-to-face and also online. But in terms of how technology can help with that, there have been some papers talking about how we can successfully have collaboration online. For example, through the use of a joint task, the sharing resources, the teacher monitoring and regulating what is happening, and building communities and groups of learners. So what do we know? Up to date is that most of the studies in this area have been heavily focused on classroom. So they are classroom-based and supported with technology, and there are fewer studies in labs or informal learning settings. Now, the educational data mining field, recent, again, review summarized studies in 5 clusters, studies analyzing student motivation, attitudes, and behavior, trying to understand different learning styles, e-learning, collaborative learning, and the use of clustering to extract data from educational systems. So the main criticism perhaps in this area is that there is a lack of use or understanding drawing from previous educational theories and pedagogy. So they are mostly focused on extracting the data, and they are less concerned on how our understanding of learning from other studies, from other fields could actually inform what this data says. And the learning analytics, perhaps most of you are familiar with that. They have a lot of things in common with the educational data mining field. It's focused mostly on instruction and communication, how best to achieve student learning objectives, and also natural language processing. Lately, some authors perceived learning analytics as an umbrella field within which you can find educational data mining. What is happening in this field now is that we observe the tendency to design dashboards for students and teachers. So for teachers in particular, to identify students at risk and provide support in order to avoid failure, and for students to self-regulate their learning. So, and this is the table I mentioned earlier on, which in a way gives a summary of how those 4 fields relate to each other and differ. So in terms of the main aim and target, we see that AI in education is about stimulating and predicting learning processes. CSCL is about understanding learning processes, especially in the classroom settings. EDM is about analyzing and extracting data from educational systems, and the learning analytics tries to improve learning processes. In terms of their relations to educational theory or other philosophical underpinnings, we see that in AED there are not specific theories attached to that field, while in the CSCL field we see theories like communication theories, social constructivism, sociocultural theories, and even social psychology being used to understand and explain learning. In educational data mining, there is again no reference of any theories that could inform our understanding. And in learning analytics, we see more and more researchers using theories like connected learning, self-regulation, and social constructivism. Now the techniques or methods they use to extract data. AED is heavily relied on machine learning. CSCL is about discourse analysis, content analysis, social network analysis. ETM is about computational modeling and machine learning again. Statistics, and of course a lot of visualizations. And in LA, again, they have similar techniques as EDM, like discourse analysis, natural language processing, and machine learning. So why we did this work? First, we wanted to flag or emphasize perhaps that there is a lot of progress happening in terms of understanding, learning, and teaching, especially supported by technologies across these 4 fields. Yet we think that much more could be achieved if the artificial, I would say, boundaries between those fields were waved away, and researchers from across those fields could work together in an interdisciplinary manner. And there are different ways this could be achieved. Perhaps one suggestion is the funding, and whether funding should be given to work that is interdisciplinary in nature. And this is something we started seeing the last few years from major funding bodies like the UKRI. Then it could be achieved through networks of researchers that are coming from different disciplines, and maybe this could be facilitated in conferences. With specific tracks, or even journals when they are actually requesting special issues that are inviting researchers from different disciplines to contribute. Having said that, it's not that nothing has been done towards that direction. I don't know who of you attended that or remember that, but a few years ago we had the Festival of Learning in London, which brought together the International Conference of the Learning Sciences, the International Conference of Artificial Intelligence in Education, and the Learning at Scale, which was an effort to bring closer those different disciplines. And also is another initiative, the International Alliance to Advance Learning in the Digital Era, that brings together different societies with the aim to discuss about and progress the field of educational technology, like the ISLS, SOLAR, and AED. So we hope that in the future we're going to see much more initiatives towards that direction, where researchers with different backgrounds and expertise from those fields will be working together to understand and enhance further learning, and in particular learning with technology. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Tara. I haven't seen questions in the chat, so people can probably type now or can just raise their hands.
Just to say that we're going to have very soon a paper coming out of this presentation, published open access in Frontiers. And maybe for those that are not very familiar with these areas, it could be a good starting point, a good introduction as to what this field may look like. That could lead them, of course, to other reading.
Thank you, Tara. And Eileen has a question.
Yes, thanks very much. Yeah, that was really interesting. I noticed at the end when you were looking about bringing societies together, I missed the connection to educational data mining. You know, I can see those integrating societies with like ICLS and AIED a bit. So I just wondered whether you think that the educational data mining community is joining in this kind of interdisciplinary area for consideration, and if it is, what's our best chance of becoming aware of the work that they are doing?
Well, I mean, I don't remember the list of all the societies, for example, that are part of this alliance, but as far as I know, in terms of the educational data mining, is that a lot of the researchers coming from this area have now shifted towards learning analytics. So there may be representation from that community within learning analytics because of the similarities of the two, and because of the fact that a lot of researchers see educational mining as one stream of learning analytics. But I mean, I don't have I have to look back and see which societies are part of these initiatives. Yeah, but I don't have a more specific answer, I would say.
No, that's really helpful. Thanks, Thea. And I do applaud the, as you imagine I would, the interdisciplinary effort that you're putting in here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, and now Vicky also raised her hand. Vicky, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. I think it's often a question we have, if you're not in any of these areas, what's the difference between machine learning and AI and learning analytics? So the presentation was very clear. Really appreciated it. My question is about the role of theory. When I was looking at your table, that was one of the things that was really clear to me, like that especially the educational data mining doesn't really use theoretical frameworks to guide its analysis. Do you find that when you're working in interdisciplinary projects with people from these different areas, that there are things like this which actually cause confusion and people want to do things in quite different ways because they don't have the same theoretical basis or the same understandings about how you do research in a way?
Well, perhaps I should share an experience I had in one of the conferences I attended in the past, where I saw a researcher from a data mining, I would say, background, presenting something out of the data that came out of the data as something new to education, which was very surprising to me because I don't remember what exactly it was, but for me it was something really old that we studied for so many decades and we knew very well how to do and how to explain. So my feeling is that if we are working in silos and we don't bring researchers together, we are missing the innovation. We may be talking about things as being new, while for other disciplines these are not actually new. So my feeling is that we need to, facilitate ways that researchers with different backgrounds should work together.
Thanks. I really, yeah, it strikes a chord with me. I've been working with people in the oil professions, and they're very engineering, data mining kind of driven, but they still talk about learning styles and things like this, which to me is very old, outdated kind of educational theory that's has pretty much been disproven. So, yeah, thanks.
That's true. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Vicky and Per. Any other questions? We still have some time, so we have room for questions. As was pointed out in the chat, the table that we have on the slide is really useful, where we have comparison of the targets, aims of the different concepts. This is really useful. Do we have a question, or shall we proceed to the next presentation?
Just a very small point, Irina. I don't know whether this is worth considering. I was thinking about the combination of methods. So there are certain methods which would work well in a set, and certain would not work well in a set, and whether there is some more addition to be done into the table where a particular set of methods has worked well by giving a reference to it. That was just a small thought I had.
Well, thank you for that. Actually, in the discussion of the paper, we talk about where the overlap is. So this table was more about to show how they differ. But you're right that a lot of more methods have been used, and maybe across these fields.
We're just keeping an eye on the chat. Right, thank you so much there. I think there are no further questions. And please don't forget that we have a Twitter account, so we can tweet about the presentations and the thoughts that we have from the conference. And I think Elisa also asked the question, where is the table going to be published, or is it published? So I think the question is about the source of the table.
Yes, so that's what I was writing down, that this is going to appear in Frontiers. We replied actually to the reviewers that asked for some minor changes, and we hope that within the next few weeks it's going to be published.
Looking forward to reading that. Thank you so much, Per.
Thank you.
If there are no further questions, we are happy to proceed to our next presentation. So our next presenters are going to be Paco and Tim. Perhaps you could also say a few words about yourselves. And they're going to talk about their project admins. Over to you, Tim and Paco.
Hello. Yes, great to have everyone here. And hope you can hear me okay. And so I think this is actually quite a nice continuation of the theme from this morning. From Vanessa and Selena's talks in particular. So we're talking about a project, admins, which is really work in progress. We started on this in October, and it runs through until the end of this year in this first stage of it. And it's a project funded by Microsoft under a initiative called AI for Accessibility. And the idea of that really is to take AI into directions where it's purposefully tackling issues for disabled people, and actually, rather than seeing design for the majority as being a goal, it's actually looking at what AI can do in that particular arena. So Paco's presenting with me, and there's a big team of other people involved. I think I saw a couple of people online earlier, Peter, Divine, and people who are involved in the project. So the problem that admins is tackling is the idea that form filling and application processes are an ongoing challenge for people. These things are everywhere, and if you have a disability, you actually end up doing a lot more of them because you have to apply for support, and actually a lot of these processes aren't very accessible and are quite difficult. And study is a particular area where there's a lot of demand on people and a lot of burden on people to keep applying and adding information and telling people the same information again and again. So we did some research onto this issue a couple of years ago now, and we did a survey with Open University students who declared disabilities and confirmed this idea that these application processes and filling in forms were a burden on them. The interesting and perhaps slightly depressing thing about this is the processes that are designed to support when they declare a disability in order to get support were the ones that were most challenging. And they're quite complex processes, and people have to talk about their medical conditions and needs and all these things. It's not a very pleasant thing for people to do. And we also found that there were a lot of impacts of these processes. So people had to repeat sensitive information, which isn't very pleasant. The processes often entailed delays to them getting support. Stress was a very common outcome, and people had various kinds of exacerbation of their disabilities and poor assignments. People were reporting that actually having to do this and having to wait and all the other things was reducing their success as students. And in the Open University context, which is where admins is starting, we have what's called a disability support form, which is what students do after they've initially declared a disability to us. And it asks them about how the disability will affect their studies. Once they've completed this form, they should have a conversation with an expert advisor. So we have disability support teams that talk to students and give them phone calls, or can talk to them through text chat as well. But at peak periods, there are thousands of new students declaring disabilities, and for various reasons, a lot of those students might not get a phone call. The advisors will always try to phone the students, but it may not happen. The goal for the admins project really was to try and build a virtual assistant, so something similar to what Selena was showing earlier, that enables students with disability to provide this information and to access support by speaking or writing and having a dialogue. So the assistant would build a profile about them and provide support suggestions. And the key thing about the process we're doing in this project is that participation of students and advisors and their conversations, so looking at how they talk to each other, is a key aspect of what we're doing. And as I said, it's very much about getting participation of people at every stage. So we've been running design workshops with advisors and students. Obviously, we were quite lucky to get face-to-face workshops done before the current lockdown. We have student consultants who are working on the project, and it's starting to get really interesting in that they come up with their own kind of topic that they're interested in doing some work on. And there's an agile development process that the team's going through. So there's a continual kind of iteration and getting feedback and learning how to use the technology, but also understanding what people would actually want out of it. And finally, there will be a trial where we're going to try and see this assistant as an alternative to completing the disability support form that I just mentioned. So as I said, we've been listening to students, running workshops, having those consultancies, and really kind of looking into different aspects of how the current process works and what people think about it. And I'll hand over to Paco to talk about some of the research and some of the findings.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, indeed, keeping that participatory research approach, and as well having done a literature review on the area of accessible and usable virtual assistants, we try to keep that vision of feedback from advisors and students. So working with the data we have from 2 of the workshops, the first one in Milton Keynes last November, with 5 students and 3 advisors, and one in February in Edinburgh with 8 students and 5 advisors. And considering we have 5 students working and collaborating with us as student consultants, we need to keep those design aspects we want to keep consistently in terms of doing this participatory research approach and how that affects to the design in admins. So some of the key aspects we are keeping track from what students, advisors, and previous research in the area is letting us know is that well, the disability support form, as said, is quite staff-oriented. It's designed to help to get information that is going to be useful for university as well, but we need to consider that perspective that makes the students feel comfortable working with admins and have this empathy. As well, is we consider and to be accessible through multiple communication modalities, having the use of text and voice at the moment, and the development of alternative formats like videos to explain different aspects from the view, and to work through multiple devices and operating systems. As well, in terms of the conversation, which is a kind of hot topic at the moment in the design, consider the user engagement and having that flexibility and options which are taking care, and having that supportive feeling and that iteration with admins that makes them feel comfortable and avoids repetition and work with conversation repair, making a friendly environment. Linked with that is as well the personality design. So admins needs to keep that OU look and feel, alignment with our goals and values, and as well the understanding of users and their needs, which is the main one of the main aspects in the project. And as well to consider personalization in terms of how we can actually reach the point of having different languages on different personalization aspects within the project. This approach, looking at the literature and mostly with the students consultants, is really very helpful to understand the evaluation process we are going to follow we are following in admins, and in that sense, designing protocols for first trial or design trial going to happen over the summer, and the main trial at the end of the project. Trying to follow a person-centered planning approach where those who are going to participate will decide how they want to do it and provide different tools for that. And with the main aspect of students being able to interact with admins and provide feedback as well. It's going to be a mix of different methods. So there's going to be observation from our side, probably follow-up interviews with students, and using different questionnaires that the literature is showing us that are being used in terms of virtual assistants and how to get information related with their usability and user experience plus accessibility.
Do you want me to come back in here? Yep. Okay, so one of the really interesting things about this project has been thinking about all the data that's actually collected through the existing processes and how we understand student support, really. So there is actually, a lot of data that's generated through these processes, and there's also things that we're looking at, like the conversations and how the advisors talk to students in such a way that they have a successful conversation that's good for the student, also gets the information that's useful for the university. So we've looked a lot at advisor-student conversations and call recordings of those, and they do tend to follow a common structure, but obviously there's variations between them depending on the situations and the things the student asks questions about. We've also looked at the forms, so the completed disabled disability support forms provide another source of data that we can look at, and it's quite interesting to see very common requests or very common points that students make in those forms, but also there's a long tail of other things they talk about. This is just an example of a diagram that kind of shows the conversation flow which happens in a normal disability support call with the advisor and the student. So it's one of the things that started to guide us when we designed admins in the way that it was going to talk to students. So they go through kind of identifying them, talking to the student about who they are and what they want to get out of the call, talking to them about the different allowances and talking to them about their disabilities, how it affects their studies, and things like alternative formats, tutorials, exams, these things. So in a sense that can guide us to understand what we want the assistant to be able to do, but as I said, there's a lot of variation in these calls as well. And you can see a little bit here, I mean, this was a very early screenshot of the assistant, that it kind of shows one of the ways in which it can do quite a good job in comparison to a form. The OU has certain categories of disability and needs to map what the student tells us to those categories. But obviously from the student's point of view, they may not know which categories they fit into. And actually it's not a very nice way of talking about yourself. But the assistant can identify based on free text that student inputs what categories it thinks they fall under. So in this case, saying the student says, sometimes I suffer with depression, my sight is not good, and the assistant recognizes, because depression has been mentioned, that there's a mental health issue there. And as I said, the DSF forms are another form of data that we've explored. There are thousands of these submitted, and they can be anonymized, and we can really analyze them only in terms of the keywords that are occurring in them. And things that come up very commonly, things like cannot sit for long periods of time, wanting audio versions of printed material, cannot concentrate for long periods of time, may take more time. These are the kind of things students are saying that they need. Under another heading, what support might they need from the tutor? The most common thing students saying is they prefer contact by email. They want extra time to complete assignments, and they want handouts in advance. So these are very interesting in terms of training the assistant and knowing what we need it to be able to deal with, but they're also quite interesting for the university in terms of understanding what students are asking for. And there's a wider context to all of this. So really, this isn't just a problem for the OU or our students, and it is an issue that all universities face. Obviously, most of them have particular times of year where students register, and so there's likely to be some kind of bottleneck around getting the human support that is really valuable to them. It's worth saying, from our point of view, it's not about replacing that human support. There's several stages to the process. So we currently have a form and then ideally a follow-up call. We're trying to replace the form with an assistant and see whether that creates better information at that stage of the process. And we're thinking about that in terms of augmenting the advisor's role and giving them better information, hopefully reducing the amount of repetition in what they have to say to students, because the first stage has already got useful information out of it. But we might also see that in other settings, there isn't the human support available. So if we take, for example, open educational resources or MOOCs offered in situations where you don't have a university with a lot of disability support, then the assistant might operate as a way to help students independently. And there's also a lot of these processes beyond study. So there's things like trying to get benefits and stuff like that, where an assistant could be really useful. So it's just a starting point, and I think we're recognizing there's lots of other applications once we understand how this can be done in the OU. So to finish off, next steps really for us, we're still developing the assistant. Several areas we're exploring. the accessibility of these types of interfaces isn't something that's really been researched in detail. So that's obviously really important to us. Adapting to user needs is really interesting, and it's partly why virtual assistants, could be very good for accessibility, because you can adjust a lot of things back. Does it talk to you? What speed does it talk to you? Things like that. And as Paco said, there's a lot of work around refining that conversational flow and understanding breakdowns. So when people misunderstand or they show that they're not really understanding the question that's been asked, how does the assistant help them through that process? And as I said, we're iterating through this, and there'll be a main trial later on in 2020. I think that's it for us. Happy to answer any questions. There's a bit of time.
Thank you, Team Paco. You're really punctual with the timing. So now we have room for questions. I see that people are uploading. Fridolin has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, hi. Thanks, fantastic work you're doing there. I love that. I'm sure it will be very useful to have in the future. Regarding the evaluation, I was wondering if there is room to look also into trust. What level of trust people develop towards the admin bot. And as I'm asking because Sinew and I, Sinew, who is also on this call, have developed a trust scale to evaluate artificial intelligences, and we're very keen on taking that to the next level. Maybe that's something we could work on together.
Yeah, that would be a very interesting point. I think the only level we've really thought about that at is in terms of having mechanisms to make sure that if the assistant interprets something that the person has said, that the person can check that it's accurate. So it's a very simple sense of trust. We haven't looked into trust in detail, and yeah, that could be really helpful. I think it's something that in terms of how the conversation is designed and the personality that's given to the assistant, we're thinking about. But yeah, that sounds really useful. So yeah, happy to hear more about that.
And if we have space,
Thanks a lot.
as I understand it, you are currently not using any avatar or any 3D character. Have you been thinking about that? And why did you decide not to?
I think at this stage, it's a matter of working with something that can work with voice and text, and potentially with some media, but not necessarily an avatar. I think I suppose we're yet to be convinced of what that would add, but I think very happy to have the conversation. Yeah, it was interesting to see Selena's example with an avatar. Yeah, I think for us we've mostly been focused on what the conversation is like, and in terms of adaptability, that to make sure that it works through speech and works through text modalities, and you're not losing anything. But of course, yeah, if we can see that there's a value to an avatar, then absolutely. As Chris is there. Yeah. Is Chris able to ask his question, or?
Sorry, I was double muted then. It was just when we were thinking about trust, and I think the scale of trust idea is really useful, so I'd like to know more about that as well. But from work that we were doing with Tesla, which was about e-authentication of students, we ended up with this idea of layers of trust that obviously students basically trust the university itself and the way in which we've worked. We've been around a long time, and we've got a particular reputation. So there's kind of a fundamental trust there. But then there's all sorts of layers below that, and so it might get to a point where a particular technology, for whatever reason, particular students might not be particularly trusting of, even though they trust the organisation. So there was this idea of layers of trust, and that might help add a dimension to any discussion on trust.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I mean, one of the things that comes to mind in our early experiments is the problem of where the assistant doesn't understand that the student is, he's not answering the question, but trying to achieve something else. And when you get into those situations where the assistant kind of doesn't look very smart anymore, that's an example where some form of trust could be lost for sure. So yeah, I think there are different, I suppose when we talk about trust, it's a very complex topic. That's just one example that comes to mind of, I suppose, trusting that the assistant is able to do its job is interesting, yeah.
Do we have any further questions? It's nice to have the link to the paper that you've published so we can read further on the work that you are doing.
Yeah, that was an early piece because, as we said, there's really not much out there about what it means to make a conversational user interface accessible as opposed to a website or a mobile application where there's quite clear guidelines and testing approaches. So there's a lot of people feel that these types of virtual assistants and things could be very good for people with disabilities, but actually haven't got into the details. So that was the focus of that paper, or it does talk about the project a bit as a case.
All right, if there are no further questions, let's give a round of applause to the team and Paco. Thank you so much, and we're looking forward to reading more on your work.
Thanks very much for listening.
All right, and now we have time for the final presentation in this session. And just a reminder that all the presentations, this is the in-house research from IT, from our department. Rebecca will talk about universal design for learning. Over to you, Rebecca.
Okay, thanks very much, Irina. Shout anyone if you can't hear me very well. So this is reporting on research which I've carried out with Leanne Perriman and Simon Ball. And Leanne's not been able to make it today, but Simon is here today, so can answer questions that I can't answer, I hope. This is bringing together two elements: universal design for learning, which you may already know about, and offline options for online learners. So just before I start, I'm going to come up with a reflection opportunity. Oh, look, the scale of these slides is not the same as the scale of my slides, so they're going to look a bit strange. Right. I've phrased it for you, but I think it applies to everybody here. Should your context where you work in, phase out downloadable study materials, just as we phased out other technologies which are becoming dated and passé now? That's something you might want to sort of think about in the chat, or perhaps tweet about. I've put the hashtag here. You may have a view on it at this point, or you may change your view as I go on with the presentation. So our research is looking at why you might want offline and printable materials. So it's only fair to start off with the arguments for why you might not want them, because the Open University is beginning to think about, is it time to move to online only? And I'm thinking about this in the context of accessibility and openness. Which is the approach which brings in the most students, makes it most accessible for students? Now, the thing we hear most often from management at the Open University is that the printable versions are time-consuming and expensive to produce. Now, that's not so much the case with our Moodle VLE, because there is a download option built into that, which we've used over many years. But increasingly, the Open University is beginning to think about moving its credit-bearing courses onto FutureLearn, at least some of them, and that's what it's going to be doing with micro-credentials, for example. And FutureLearn doesn't have an automatic download option. So the question is, do we want to spend the time and money which it requires to produce a downloadable, printable version? Now, you may think that is a fairly straightforward thing to do. So, you spend a couple of hours with Control-C and Control-V, and then you've got it all. And that would work if you're a student. But if you're a university trying to put out a professional, accessible product, then you've got to pay attention to putting in all the pictures, putting in all the copyrights, putting in the transcripts for the videos, putting in the alt text for the pictures. So it's a significant task. And balanced against that is the fact that if we present courses on FutureLearn, we're beginning to make them more open, we're beginning to make them more accessible. Because although theoretically most courses at the OU are accessible around the world, in point of fact most of our students are based in the UK. And so one of the reasons for a move to FutureLearn is to bring more learners in, which of course is good for the Open University, but also we hope is good for those learners, gives them more opportunities. Another problem that we have with the printable versions is they need to be the same as the online materials, because if you have two versions of your materials, it creates all sorts of problems for students. And this in the past has meant it's difficult to upload or to update our online materials. You want to keep them completely in sync, so we tend to do it when a course is finished, rather than picking up problems as the course goes along. So if we just have one version, we might be able to be a bit more flexible about it and update as we go. There's also the learning opportunities, being able to study online, being able to work online. These are important employability skills and study skills. If we just stick with printable materials, which students are happy with, familiar with, perhaps we're disbenefiting them by not helping them to move on into what is useful today. There's also the point we're an online university. Students come expecting to study online. And we do have to bear in mind that we have left previous technologies behind us. And at each point, as we gave up cassettes, there were some people who said, I can only play cassettes. When we gave up videos, people said, I can only play videos. But we did have to move on eventually. So that's another thing that we have to bear in mind. But in the context of all this, there's also a worldwide push to move more to digital. So there's the digital first strategy, Pearson, big online education provider across the world, but also specific universities such as Sunderland, such as Ohio State, have moved to a digital first position. And a similar position is the digital by default position. In fact, I'm not really quite sure what the distinction between the two of them is. But you can see again, this is happening in Vietnam, it's happening in Leicester, it's happening in the College of Policing. People are beginning to move away from print-based and into digital. And if you've been around the Open University in the last 3 years or so, you probably can't have failed to hear about digital by design, which was a beautiful alliterative slogan, but was quite complicated to unpick, as you can see from the contents of this report. There's lots of different aspects of digital you have to take into account. And that's one of the things we're trying to do in this research. We're also thinking about this in the context of universal design for learning, which will be something you know about if you're working in the area of accessibility or inclusion. If you haven't come upon it, let me encourage you to go and look at www.cast.org, because there's lots of information there. But basically, it's about increasing accessibility for all students, and it's on the works on the principle that if you extend possibilities for one set of students, you essentially extend possibilities for all of them. And we shouldn't just think about, oh, we're doing accessibility for disabled students. We're doing accessibility for all students. And there are some important principles which cast outlines in their guidelines. The one I'm going to pick up on here is about options for perception. And I've pulled out a line at the bottom here. It's important to ensure that key information is equally perceptible to all learners. And really our research is thinking about, does that mean it has to be available offline and in printable form? Or does that mean we need to think about how to make it equally perceptible online? My next button is not working right. So coming to the actual research, a skim read of our data told us there were benefits to students of offering downloadable versions of online study materials and supporting offline study, which is why we haven't phrased the research question along the lines of are there any benefits. We wanted to investigate what the benefits are. And the group that we studied this with was a group of 100 postgraduate learners on an online course that was run by the Open University on the FutureLearn platform. We felt that that group of students would be the ones most likely to embrace an all online experience, partly because they're postgraduates, so they're experienced learners, partly because they were studying technology enhanced learning, and partly because many of them had studied with the Open University before. So you can see that although 46 of them were new to the Open University and possibly new to online learning, 10 of them had been studying with the Open University for 20 years or more, and the other, about 40% of them, had been studying somewhere between 1 and 20 years with the Open University. So a good range of experience. We also had a really good data set because this was on FutureLearn. If you've looked at FutureLearn courses, you'll know that they don't have separate forums where all the comments are tucked away separate from the resources. There are conversations on every step, and conversation is built into the pedagogy, and certainly was built into the pedagogy of this course. So we had about 17,000 comments. We hadn't asked students particularly about, do you like using printable materials? Do you like using online materials? Do you like using offline materials? We were interested in what came up naturally in the conversation. And we also followed this up, the survey which Simon carried out, a post-course survey which had 30 respondents, which you'll notice because we had 100 students sign up, we can do percentages really easily on this data set, which was lovely. So one of the things we found out from the study was that all our students, or the majority of our students anyway, reported having limited access to online materials at some point or another. So it might have been assumed in advance that the people who'd have problems with access might be people with particular disabilities, might be people in particular countries which didn't have good internet infrastructure. But in point of fact, most of our students are based in the UK. Most of them we'd have expected to have good access to online materials. But you can see that some of them couldn't study while they were travelling. Some of them said, you know, I spent a lot of time on aeroplanes, I spent a lot of time in taxis, I wanted to study then, I can't study then. Several of our students went on holiday, couldn't access it then. Some who'd wanted to study at work thought that was the best place to study, but they found that there were firewall restrictions. Our student based in China, for example, had a firewall restriction. We had one student who wasn't living in a secure environment, but was certainly working in a secure environment, found they were restricted. Parts of the country, and you've probably experienced this as you've moved around yourselves, that some places have better internet coverage than others. Some parts of your home probably have better internet coverage than others. And unless you've got great boosters or a very small house, you've probably got bits of your house that don't really get the internet. And sometimes our students have to work in those areas. Online's expensive, especially if you're doing it on a mobile device. So if you were doing it while commuting, for example, eating up your data contract. And lots of smaller problems reported by a few people, the technical problems, the inconsistent coverage. And although this wasn't during the pandemic, of course, many of you will have experienced during the pandemic that when all your family is at home trying to get online, everybody keeps bumping everybody else off the internet. So there is limited access there. But also, students are saying we want offline materials as well. And when I talk about offline materials, I'm not necessarily saying not on the digital device. I'm saying you don't need to be on the internet to be accessing them. So students sometimes struggled reading long things online. Sometimes they wanted to print them out, but sometimes they simply wanted to move them to an ebook reader or to a tablet where they could read them somewhere else. Some people were doing clever things with their resources. They might want to listen while they were out running. They might want to listen while they were commuting, so they were converting things to audio files, so they needed offline for that. A lot of students were talking about learning journals and notes. They wanted to be able to do annotations. And although the OU's explored doing that online with its Open Create pilot, that's not a facility which is available with FutureLearn. A big problem for a lot of our students was the lack of a search facility within courses on FutureLearn. Of course, this isn't really a problem if you're doing an 8-hour MOOC. It's not very difficult to search an 8-hour MOOC. But if you're doing a 60-credit course with 600 study hours and it runs for 8 months, it is a real problem trying to find things. And offline materials are searchable. That's a good option. And there was also the psychological difference between if you've been spent all day working online on a computer, perhaps you just want to take a break and access your studies in some other way. There's also a specific need for printable materials because students simply prefer it, but also because your mobile device, the text may be too small to read, it doesn't really fit on the screen, it's just a bit shimmery, so there are accessibility issues there. And if you've only, for example, got a desktop computer and everything's online, then you have to sit by that desktop computer, whereas you can take your printed materials pretty much everywhere. They're much more flexible. There's also the advantage that they can be sent out in advance and people can look at them before the course goes live, because FutureLearn courses go live on their start date. They're not like Moodle courses where you get 2 weeks of early access beforehand. And this is an issue for many of our students who are often very good at self-regulation, have planned when they want to do their study, and sometimes need to be able to get ahead. And of course, there's the option of taking a break from technology. Transcripts is a slightly different issue, but that's also a downloadable printable resource. Lots of students were using those. It wasn't just a question of I can't hear the video. It was a question of we find a use for the transcripts. They provide a way of negotiating around the video resource. So if you've once watched it, you might think, oh yes, I want to find the bit where this happens. That's much easier if you've got a transcript. If the language of the video is too complex for you, perhaps it's too academic, or perhaps English isn't your first language, you can use your transcript to check unfamiliar words, or you can just run the whole thing through Google Translate and compare it with something in your first language. You can use it when you can't turn up the sound and when you can't get online for some reason or another. So overall, we found that there was a variation by context, that you couldn't say this is a student who will need offline materials and this isn't. what you could say is in some contexts people will need these offline materials, and in some cases they won't. And that changes over time. That changes depending on where you are and what you're doing when you're studying. It depends if you planned in a holiday or a work trip or bigger change. You know, with 100 students, there's bound to be somebody who's moving house or some big change happening. And that some things go wrong. There's bound to be somebody who ends up in hospital or has to go and look after somebody. So a lot of context changes. And it's also, we found it interesting that these have different affordances, that it's not purely about whether you can access the online materials, it's the use that you can make of downloadable and printable materials. That students were looking at different sorts of tasks in different sorts of way, that they associated them with different ways of thinking and studying, and that it had different emotional responses, and those influenced study as well. So I'll wind up with another reflection opportunity, just to sort of prompt you to think about, is this relevant to your work and teaching? Are you thinking about moving things more online, more offline, more printable, less printable? Is there anything that it affects you and might make a change in your studies, in your works? I'll finish off just with links to the three of us on Twitter, so that if you want to follow up, you can follow up. And if you want to download the slides, they're up on SlideShare at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was really interesting. And we have exactly 8 minutes for questions. So feel free to raise your hand and give a round of applause to Rebecca and the team. The chat has been really active. It was very interesting to keep an eye on the chat. I think some of the things that were pointed out in the chat is that during lockdown, we now sympathize even more with students like Open University students and how much time they spend with the screen and the importance of being able to download materials. Also the inequalities that the lockdown brought into place, like access to internet. Are there any questions that we can ask Rebecca and the team? All right, so Joe was the first one to raise her hand. Joe, over to you.
I think actually it was questions from Eileen and Chris Edwards, Mark had just said, so I think I'm probably third.
I can answer a question for you anyway, Joe.
I was just going to ask about, you were saying earlier about the problem with alt text and things like that for providing printable alternatives. What was the issue there you were saying? Because I couldn't quite follow.
Oh, the thing is, if you go quickly through a FutureLearn course, and I've done this myself, you know, you can go in and you can say, right, select all, copy it, paste it into a document. You can go through, zoom through like that. But that way you end up missing out the pictures, or if you put in the pictures, you don't pick up the alt text with the pictures.
Right.
So it's just adding all the accessible elements, and it's seeing those as important and as things that you'd want to have in your transcripts rather than just.
So essentially, you're saying there's a problem in, in printing, making PDFs from the web pages, for example, and those not having the accessibility features that the web page has, because I thought they did. I may be wrong.
Yeah, so they do if you download from the VLE. The VLE is set up to generate them in various formats, which can be read by various, I'm not terribly au fait with this, but they can be output in sort of 5 or so different formats quite easily. But in FutureLearn, you've got to do all that manually. So somebody has got to sit down and spend several days working it out. And that is one of the reasons that the Open University is dubious about whether it wants to do it as it moves courses onto FutureLearn. So although the MAODE courses over there it's been done carefully and properly. It hasn't necessarily been done with micro-credentials.
Right, which is a shame really, because I think that seems like a backward step to me, but I...
So that's one of the reasons for doing this research, because we're arguing it's not just a backward step for students who've got specific accessibility issues, it's a backward step for all our students.
Right, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Sorry if I missed some of the raised hands. I think sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between a clap and a raised hand because both gestures involve hands.
Yeah.
But do flag it if you have a question. Irene, over to you. So Irene had a question.
Hello, it all went quiet for me for a bit. Can you hear me all right, Rebecca?
Yeah, you're a bit quiet, but yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'll try and check. I think I understood the logic, which was very interesting logic, which is making things accessible for one group of students helps to make things better for all students. And you had a very nice line about the kind of activities that you might want to do that would be made easier by making it easier for people to have things that are accessible offline. What do you think a course designer should do though then? I mean, it's very convincing research that there's lots of things that contribute to what you should do in a particular situation, and it can be variable even at the level of small groups of students, what would help them. How do you negotiate that then as a course designer with the systems that you currently have available to you?
Well, I think we're still in the discussions around, is it really important to have the offline printable versions? And I think possibly if you haven't looked at it in this level of detail, or you don't have a personal interest, like you've always been pushing for accessibility, you probably find the arguments that I put forward at the beginning quite compelling arguments for, yes, this does open things up, and so this is the direction we should be going in. But I think we are still in the discussion phase on that. We're still in the argument phase. And what I'd like to think is that at some point we will convince FutureLearn that they really should have this export option. Because it's not just a question of the Open University. This is a question of the accessibility of an entire platform, which has got 10 million learners registered for it. And I'd like to see us having an effect on that. But if we absolutely can't have an effect on that, then we need to be thinking about perhaps these are parts of the course where we definitely need something downloadable that people could use. But as I say, the learning journal aspect I found quite compelling. So many students. And it was interesting because quite often it was the students who were saying, I am now making the transition from doing written notes to doing online notes, and I'm finding all these innovative ways of doing online notes. Oh, but there isn't a copy of the course that I can annotate, and that's what I'd like to do. So it wasn't just you know, there's thinking that, oh, it's just these stick-in-the-mud students who are used to print and they haven't really thought about it. These were students who put a lot of thought into it and were really transitioning to digital, but we weren't supporting them with it.
That's great and very powerful, I think. So thanks for the talk, Rebecca.
Thank you all. We actually reached the end of the scheduled session. So if you'd like to ask further questions, please do contact Rebecca and the team. Yes, so let me just announce what we have next on the program. Thank you so much, Rebecca, once again. So next on the program is afternoon tea. And we will be back here in 10 minutes, 2:20 for section 2, and we will hear more presentations. Just a reminder that we also have space in Microsoft Teams where you can bring your tea and talk to other people, and also we're using Twitter, so please do share things that you find interesting from the sessions. Thank you all once again, and please do contact speakers if you have any further questions. Thanks a lot.